The office of Elias Vance smelled of aged paper and fine dust. It wasn't the dust of neglect, but the kind that settles ceremonially upon things no one has touched for decades. Elias was an archivist, an organizer of other people's memories, hired by ancient families and bankrupt corporations to bring order to the chaos of their documents. For him, order was a shield against the unpredictability of the outside world. At 45, he lived alone in a small, immaculate apartment, his social life limited to brief exchanges with rare book dealers and the owners of storage units filled with forgotten history. His world was a system of cross-referenced files and labeled boxes, a place where everything had its proper place. He preferred it that way. Human connections were messy, prone to errors and misinterpretations. Papers, on the other hand, if properly archived, always told the truth. This belief in the inherent truth of documents was about to be tested in a way he never imagined. The news of his sister's death arrived not in a formal letter, but through a crackling international phone call, shattering the silence of his ordered life like a stone through a window. It was a moment that would force him out of his carefully constructed world and into a dangerous game of cat and mouse. It was the French police who called. An accident, they said. His younger sister, Clara, had been found in the old port of Marseille. She had slipped on the wet stones of the quay, hit her head, and fallen into the water. Clara Vance was a respected art restorer, a woman whose life was a blur of vibrant colors and constant travel. She moved through the great cities of Europe, restoring faded frescoes in ancient churches and delicate canvases in prestigious museums. She was the exact opposite of Elias. Where he organized the past, she gave new life to the past of others. Their relationship, conducted through postcards and brief emails, was a distant but steady connection. The news of her death hit him with a force he did not expect. It wasn't just grief, it was the sudden, violent intrusion of chaos into his life. The police report was brief and conclusive: accidental death, case closed. The authorities in Marseille were satisfied that it was a tragic mishap, a combination of wet weather and an unguarded moment. For the local police, it was an open and shut case. But for Elias, the case was far from closed. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. His sister was too careful, too aware of her surroundings to simply slip and fall. A few weeks later, a small box arrived from the consulate containing Clara's meager personal effects from Marseille. Inside, he found simple clothes, a sketchbook filled with detailed drawings of architectural details, her professional brushes, and one single roll-up canvas. It was a clumsy study, a still life depicting a single, withered apple. It looked like the work of a student, nothing worthy of a restorer of Clara's caliber. Elias was about to put the canvas aside when a small detail stopped him cold. The canvas was rolled with the painted side facing inward. It was a small thing, a minor detail, but it screamed at Elias. Clara, in her professional obsession with preserving art, would never do that. Rolling a painting with the image facing inward could crack the paint, damage the very thing she dedicated her life to preserving. It was a fundamental error, the kind a novice would make, not a master restorer. Puzzled, he carefully unrolled the canvas on his clean, wooden desk. As the surface flattened, a tiny flake of paint detached and fell onto the polished wood. He picked it up, holding it to the light. It was a small, hard chip, but it revealed something startling. It wasn't a single layer of paint, but two distinct layers. Underneath the dull, brownish paint of the withered apple, there was a fragment of a petal, painted with a vibrancy and a technique that was completely absent from the amateurish top layer. It was as if someone had painted a masterpiece and then deliberately covered it with a crude copy. A chill went down Elias's spine. This wasn't just a clumsy painting. It was a secret. He spent the rest of the night examining the chip under a magnifying lamp, his archivist's mind already shifting into high gear. He remembered Clara's last email, mentioning she was in Marseille for a private commission. She had been hired to assess and restore a small 16th-century Italian painting for a reclusive British billionaire named Julian Forrester. The name meant nothing to Elias then, but now, staring at the hidden petal, it meant everything. The police saw an accident. Elias saw a clue that demanded a closer look, a thread that needed to be pulled. Elias began his investigation the only way he knew how, through documents. He started with Clara's digital records, which she always backed up and shared with him for safekeeping. He accessed her restoration reports, technical documents filled with chemical analysis, descriptions of brushstrokes, and high-resolution photographs. He then compared them with the public records of Julian Forrester's art collection. Forrester was a well-known figure in the discreet world of high society, a man who owned one of the most significant private collections of Renaissance art in Europe. His collection was meticulously catalogued online, with detailed histories of each piece's provenance. Elias focused on the painting Clara had been hired to work on, a purported work by the Venetian master Titian, depicting a young woman at her toilet. According to Clara's notes, the chemical composition of the pigments was slightly off. The blue of the woman's dress, derived from lapis lazuli, had a chemical signature that didn't quite match the specific quarry known to have been used by Titian's workshop. Furthermore, she described the brushwork as having a fluidity and a softness that was inconsistent with the artist's more rigid style during that period. These were subtle discrepancies, invisible to the naked eye, but glaring to a trained professional like Clara. Forrester's public catalog, however, displayed the painting with colors that matched the expected chemical profile. Someone had changed the records, or worse, someone had changed the painting itself. The discrepancy was small, but for Elias, it was the first crack in the perfect facade of Julian Forrester's collection. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source, an online forum for art restorers. Elias, using a pseudonym, spent hours reading through archived discussions about forgery techniques. He stumbled upon a thread discussing a new, almost undetectable method of fraud. It wasn't about painting a new canvas and artificially aging it. That was old news, easily caught by modern science. This new method was called overpainting. The forger would acquire a minor, low-value painting from the exact same era and region as the master they wanted to imitate. The canvas, the wood panel, the chalk ground, the base layer, everything was authentic and would pass a carbon dating test with flying colors. The fraud was in the top layer. The forger would then paint a new image directly over the old one. Often, they would paint a known sketch or a minor study by the master, something that wouldn't raise immediate suspicion. The authentic old master work, the true treasure, would be buried beneath a layer of modern paint, silenced and hidden. Only an X-ray machine could reveal the truth, the ghost of the original composition lurking beneath the surface. A skilled forger could even incorporate elements of the old painting into the new, making the deception even more seamless. The chip from Clara's canvas, the vibrant petal under the dull apple, was a perfect example. Someone had painted a worthless still life over a valuable fragment of a larger, more important work. Elias's blood ran cold. If this technique was being used on a large scale, a painting like Forrester's Titian could easily be a fake. A genuine, but minor, 16th-century portrait could be hidden under a paint layer designed to make it look like a famous, and infinitely more valuable, Titian. This was not just a simple forgery, it was a sophisticated crime against art history itself. The pieces clicked into place with terrifying clarity. Clara hadn't just been restoring a painting, she had been unwittingly authenticating a forgery. Her job was to assess the condition of the Titian and perform minor restorative work. But her meticulous nature, her professional obsession with truth, must have led her to look deeper. Perhaps she requested an X-ray, or perhaps she took a tiny sample from an edge of the canvas for pigment analysis, as she often did. Whatever the method, she found the truth hidden under the surface. The real painting beneath was not a Titian at all. It was something else, perhaps a genuine work by a lesser-known contemporary, which had been sacrificed to create a more valuable lie. Julian Forrester had spent years building the provenance of his Titian, creating a paper trail of ownership that was flawless. He had fooled the art world for decades. But Clara Vance, with her sharp eyes and her scientific tools, had seen through the illusion. She had discovered his secret. And then she had died. That accident on the wet quay in Marseille was now highly suspicious. Elias couldn't prove it yet, but he strongly suspected that Forrester, or someone working for him, had something to do with silencing the only person who could expose him. Elias felt a cold fury rise within him, a sharp, clear emotion that cut through his grief. The police had dismissed it. The art world would never know. But Elias knew. And armed only with his logic, his archival skills, and the tiny paint chip in his possession, he was determined to find the truth and bring it to light, no matter the cost. Elias knew he couldn't go to the police yet. He had no solid proof, only a theory built from a paint chip, a forum post, and a dead sister. He needed evidence, and the only place to find it was with Julian Forrester himself. He spent the next 2 weeks preparing. He built a meticulous dossier. He compiled Clara's notes, the forum discussions on overpainting, the discrepancies in the pigment analysis, and a detailed timeline of her last days in Marseille. He also did something else. He reached out, via a carefully worded and encrypted email, to a man named Dr. Alistair Finch, a renowned expert in Renaissance painting authentication at the National Gallery in London. He didn't reveal everything, only that he had a sample of paint from a disputed work and needed a confidential analysis. He sent Dr. Finch a small, carefully packaged fragment of the paint chip from Clara's canvas, the part containing the hidden petal. Dr. Finch, intrigued by the sample, agreed to analyze it. Then, Elias booked a flight to Scotland. Julian Forrester lived on a private, windswept island off the coast, a fortress of stone and glass that mirrored the man's cold and impenetrable nature. Elias had no appointment, no invitation. He simply took a small ferry to the nearest mainland town and then hired a local boatman to take him to the island's small dock. The boatman eyed him with suspicion. "Mr. Forrester doesn't like visitors," he warned. Elias just nodded, clutching a leather satchel containing his dossier. As he walked up the gravel path towards the massive gray stone mansion, the wind howling around him, he felt a sense of calm. He was no longer the passive archivist. He was an investigator, walking into the lion's den, hoping the truth would be his shield. The mansion was exactly as he imagined, cold, elegant, and silent. A butler, dressed in impeccable black, opened the heavy oak door. Elias stated his name and his purpose. To his surprise, after a brief wait in a hall lined with Renaissance paintings, he was led into a vast library. A fire crackled in a massive stone fireplace, and standing before it, with his back to Elias, was Julian Forrester. He was a tall, lean man in his 60s, with silver hair and an air of absolute authority. He turned, and his pale blue eyes assessed Elias with the cold curiosity of a scientist examining a specimen. "Mr. Vance," Forrester said, his voice smooth as polished ice. "I was terribly sorry to hear about your sister. A brilliant woman. Her work on my Titian was exemplary, right up until the tragic end." He gestured to a chair, but Elias remained standing. "Thank you for seeing me," Elias said, his voice steady. "I'm here to talk about my sister's work. And about the painting." Forrester's thin lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "The painting is perfectly fine, Mr. Vance. It's been verified by multiple experts. The accident was a great loss, but it has no bearing on the art." Elias opened his satchel and pulled out a folder. "I believe it does. My sister discovered something before she died. I have reason to believe she found inconsistencies in the painting's composition." Forrester's expression remained impassive, but his gaze sharpened. "That is a very serious accusation. You have no proof." "Proof?" Elias repeated, opening the folder. He placed a photograph of the paint chip on the table between them. "This came from a canvas my sister left behind. A crude still life she never would have painted. Underneath the top layer is a fragment of a much older, much finer work. It's a perfect example of overpainting, a technique used to create forgeries. You take a genuine, but minor, 16th century portrait and paint a more famous composition over it. The canvas, the ground, the age, they're all real. But the image on top is a modern lie." Forrester glanced at the photo, then back at Elias. His expression remained impassive, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. "Interesting theory. But a chip from a student's canvas proves nothing about my Titian." "Perhaps not alone," Elias countered, pulling out more papers. "But combined with my sister's analysis? Her notes show the pigment in the blue dress of your Titian doesn't match the historical source. The brushwork is wrong. And the provenance you so carefully constructed? I've been an archivist for 20 years, Mr. Forrester. I know how to read a paper trail. There are gaps. Convenient sales to anonymous buyers. Lost records from the war. It's a beautiful story, but it doesn't hold up to scrutiny." Forrester stared at him for a long moment. The only sound was the crackling of the fire. Then, he did something unexpected. He leaned back in his chair, a look of cool amusement on his face. "You are more persistent than your sister," he said, his voice dropping. "She was so shocked when she found out. She actually thought I would just admit to something she couldn't possibly prove." The implication hung in the air. Forrester had just confirmed Elias's worst fears. He had admitted that Clara had confronted him. Elias felt a surge of anger, but he kept his voice steady. "So she did discover the truth. And then she died. A convenient accident." Forrester tilted his head, a gesture of mock sympathy. "A tragic accident, Mr. Vance. She was emotional. She went for a walk on the quay to clear her head. The stones were very wet that night. A terrible misfortune." He took a step closer to Elias, his eyes gleaming with a cold light. "You see, the art world is built on perception. A painting's value is in its story. I curated an identity with this collection. Your sister wanted to destroy it based on a theory. I couldn't allow that to happen without defending my reputation." Elias stood his ground, though his heart was pounding. "You've just admitted she confronted you. That's a motive." Forrester smiled, a thin, unpleasant expression. "Admitted? I acknowledged she had a theory. That's all. You have no evidence of anything else. And coming here, alone, making accusations? It's quite foolish, Mr. Vance." He gave a small nod. From the shadows at the back of the library, two large men emerged. They moved silently, positioning themselves on either side of Elias. Forrester walked to his desk, his movements calm and deliberate. "The sea around my island is very cold and very deep," he said quietly. "Another tragic accident would be unfortunate. A man, consumed by grief, comes here, becomes agitated, and falls. It would be a sad echo of his sister's fate." The two men stood close, their presence a clear threat. Forrester watched, his expression one of detached interest, as if he were observing a chess game. Elias did not struggle. He remained perfectly still, his eyes locked on Forrester. "Before you do anything you might regret," Elias said, his voice calm, almost conversational, "you should know that I'm not alone in this." Forrester's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Bluffing is a sign of desperation, Mr. Vance." "Is it?" Elias replied. "Look at my jacket pocket." One of the men, with a rough hand, patted Elias's chest. He felt the hard, rectangular shape of a smartphone. He pulled it out and handed it to Forrester. The screen was lit. It showed an active call, the timer indicating it had been connected for several minutes. The name on the screen was A.F. Finch, National Gallery. Forrester's pale face went a shade whiter. He stared at the phone, then back at Elias. "Who is this?" "Dr. Alistair Finch," Elias said. "Head of Renaissance art at the National Gallery in London. I sent him a sample of the paint from under my sister's canvas a week ago. And tonight, I called him before I walked through your front door. He has been listening to this entire conversation." Forrester's hand trembled slightly as he raised the phone to his ear. He listened for a moment. Whatever he heard made his eyes widen. He ended the call and placed the phone on the desk, his composure cracking. For a long, tense moment, no one moved. The only sound was the wind outside. The two men looked at their employer, uncertainty on their faces. Forrester stared at Elias, his carefully constructed world beginning to crumble. The silence was broken by a distant sound, the low thrum of an engine. It grew louder, resolving into the distinct chop of a helicopter rotor. Forrester's face, already pale, became ashen. The authorities were on their way. The isolation of his island, which had always been his protection, was now his trap. He looked at Elias, and for the first time, there was no coldness in his eyes, only a hollow confusion. "Why?" he whispered. "What was she to you?" "Just a sister you barely saw." Elias looked at the man who had likely ordered his sister's death, the man who had just threatened him. He felt no anger, no triumph. Only a deep, profound exhaustion. "She was my family," he said simply. "And she believed in the truth. In paintings, in documents, in life. You tried to bury that truth. My job, my entire life, has been about uncovering what people try to hide." The two men, sensing the shift in power, stepped back. They were hired security, not criminals willing to face federal charges. Forrester sank into the leather chair behind his desk, looking small and diminished. The helicopter was landing on the lawn, its searchlight cutting through the darkness. Elias picked up his phone from the desk, slipped his dossier back into his satchel, and walked towards the heavy oak doors. He didn't look back. Outside, figures in dark coats were running towards the house. Elias walked past them, down the gravel path towards the dock. The boatman was waiting, his small vessel bobbing in the turbulent water. He looked from Elias to the helicopter, his eyes wide with questions. Elias just nodded and climbed aboard. As the small boat pulled away from the island, he looked back at the mansion. It stood there, dark and silent against the starless sky, a monument to greed and deception. He thought of Clara, of her vibrant laugh and her passion for rescuing beauty from the ravages of time. He took the small paint chip from his pocket, the one with the hidden petal. He held it tightly in his fist, feeling its sharp edges press into his palm. It was a tiny fragment of the past, a piece of the truth that had started it all. The wind stung his eyes, and for the first time since he got the phone call, he allowed himself to grieve. Justice would be served not by his hands, but by the law. Dr. Finch had the evidence, the recording, and the sample. Forrester would have to answer for his crimes. Clara was gone, but the truth about her, and about the art she loved, had been saved. And for Elias Vance, the archivist who believed in the power of documents, that was the only thing that mattered. He slipped the chip back into his pocket, a final, silent tribute to his sister, as the lights of the mainland grew closer through the mist. The truth, he knew, would always surface, no matter how deep it was buried.